Professor Christina Jarvis of the State University of New York at Fredonia has just published a new book titled Lucky Mud and Other Foma, a field guide to Kurt Vonnegut's Environmentalism and Planetary Citizenship. As Professor Jarvis makes clear, Vonnegut's writing connects with readers across multiple contexts, literary, economic, social, and many others, as well as environmental. And it is, in fact, by tracing how these various threads mutually amplify Vonnegut's profound environmental legacy that makes Professor Jarvis's book well worth reading in its own right. I'm Randy Kronk, a graduate of Fredonia's English department. I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to talk with Professor Jarvis about her book right after it was published. I started our conversation by asking her about the title.
Well, it's probably good to explain a title like Lucky Mud and Other Foma, isn't it? Not so obvious to non-Vonnegut fans. Well, I chose it because I think it captures the fact that human beings are at the center of so much of Vonnegut's work, and that his brand of environmentalism is human-centered. He, of course, connects climate change to economic climates, cultural climates, that sort of thing. But to explain the title, I'm going to break it into two parts. So the terms Lucky Mud and Other Foma come from Vonnegutism, which is an invented religion in his novel Cat's Cradle. And that religion is invented to provide comfort for the people of San Lorenzo because they can't provide for their economic social justice needs. So it's invented to provide comfort and it's very human-centered. Lucky Mud comes from the Vonnegut last rites and also its creation stories. And human beings are the lucky mud that got to sit up and look around. And the only way they can feel special is to think of all the other mud that didn't get to sit up and look around. And so I like that because it sort of captures our special status as a species. We are, of course, acting on the planet at the scale of a geological force. But there's also another dimension to it. It's a reminder that we are, after all, just dust and water. We are stardust and 60% water. And so it's also connecting us to our natural environment. And it's also quite humbling to remind us of that. So, and I think that captures those two poles within Vonnegut fiction. Now, the Foma part, Foma are harmless untruths, or to borrow Shankar Vedantam's term, useful delusions. They're designed to provide comfort. And I think they're necessary in both Vonnegut fiction and the world at large to give us hope in order to function in the face of so many epic problems, as well as to comfort each other. For example, a piece of Foma that I use to get through my day as an environmentalist is to remind myself that future humans, by the very nature of surviving, will probably have learned to be more cooperative and better planetary citizens and stewards. So I know that's kind of a long answer, but I think it's important for non-Vonnegut folks to understand where these terms come from.
So in the introduction to your book, you say that the book went in a different direction from the one you originally expected. How so? Well,
it definitely went in a different direction. Initially, when I conceived the project, I actually thought it was going to be very much sustainability topics, you know, a chapter on pollution and Vonnegut population, environmental justice issues. And then once I got to the Lilly Library, I realized there was a huge story behind all of his stories when I started looking at the manuscripts. Vonnegut spent sometimes decades on books or just huge gestation periods, but also many of the novels that I was going to focus on, for example, Galapagos and Slapstick, didn't have the manuscript drafts there. And so once I started diving into his papers at the Lilly Library, I discovered other things. So for example, there's an unpublished essay on the Cape Cod National Seashore, which no one has ever addressed, you know, that really gave me a different way of thinking about his work and place, or he had done a TV show. It never actually aired, but it was like, hey, Earth, we're watching you. But also just looking at the stories and the way he built his stories, I realized that there were all kinds of other levels to his environmental engagement. And so I really abandoned my initial project and gave voice to his materials. I let the materials drive the project and really just responded to the stories that were unfolding before me. And so I had to, I guess, embrace Volcanism and follow some peculiar travel suggestions. But I think in the end, the book is more authentic and true to Vonnegut's writing because I really abandoned my own, kind of categorizations and gave into his materials.
Now, as a student at Fredonia in the late 60s and early 70s, I remember Vonnegut as an almost rock star cult figure. How do you think he resonates with students today? No doubt many are responding to his humanistic messages, but other writers address those topics too and haven't had nearly his longevity or impact. How do you explain this?
I'm going to give you kind of a list of things that students find appealing, because you're right. A lot of other people kind of embrace his humanistic messages and secular humanism, and other people are creative, etc. I'll just give you the sort of four major things I see my students responding to anyway. One, they appreciate his willingness to call out injustices, whether racial, environmental, economic. They respond to his messages of kindness and decency, but they really appreciate that he always has this level of hopefulness underneath all these critiques and looking at what's wrong in both American culture and the world at large. But I think the things that really appeal to them is that combination of his dark humor. You have a novel like Galapagos, which we could see as a novel of the Anthropocene or climate fiction, but there's it's laced with humor that you don't get in a lot of sci-fi. But I also think they respond to the fact that Vonnegut's writings invite you to become a type of artificial extended family with your own inside jokes and connections, and they become that kind of extended family in the class and connect as human beings. And Vonnegut also told students to skylark, to have an intolerable lack of seriousness, take on the problems of the world, but enjoy life as well. And I don't think too many writers constantly remind young people that you should still be young people and you don't have to take the world on your shoulder. And so I think they see him as an ally. Some of his stuff is dated from the times, but he's someone who still connects, and I think it's, as you point out, because he was so connected to humanism.
Vonnegut was an incredibly innovative writer. In Breakfast of Champions, for example, he combines line drawings, metafiction, and intertextuality in a single narrative. Do you think his more inventive choices are instructive to creative writing students?
Absolutely. And bringing up Breakfast of Champions is a wonderful example because it is so creative. As you point out, it's full of drawings. Vonnegut's a character. He's a persona. He's also an author figure. He breaks the fourth wall. He has so many things going on there. But he also graded that novel a C, and there are points where the writing doesn't achieve its critiques. And I think students appreciate that willingness to be inventive and creative and to go with ideas even if it's not 100% realized success. And they like the messiness of it. They also appreciate, beyond Breakfast of Champions, Vonnegut's kind of iron will and persistence, that he was willing to keep reinventing forms, switching genres, even sometimes dabbling in art and the visual arts. And he has an enormously long career as well. And I think they really enjoy seeing the arc of his career, getting to know him as a person and a writer. And I think just that kind of deep study of an author that is truly creative, blending science fiction and drawings and all kinds of things, is just a perfect combination for that kind of immersive study. I mean, you could study any major author, but I think there's a lot of depth and richness that's somewhat unique to Vonnegut.
One of the techniques that you come back to several times in your book is defamiliarization. What is it, and why do you think he likes it so much?
So in the Vonnegut cosmos, defamiliarization is looking at things from an external perspective. So whether it's an alien's view of Earth from space, channeling, for example, Sirens of Titan with Salo's view of Earth, or using Kilgore Trout, which is his alter ego, to have embedded stories that get us to look at things differently. It's a technique that he gets us to get outside of our normal way of thinking to evaluate deeply held cultural truths or identities. And I think it really comes from his background as a cultural anthropologist. He studied at Chicago after the war, and it's that outsider view that is really a secret ingredient in his fiction. And whether you look to his first novel, Player Piano, when he adds the Shah of Bratpur to really have that outsider view at the system, or if you look to, as I said, Kilgore Trout, we already mentioned, who's an alter ego who appears in so many of his novels. It's when he kind of sees that creative outsider view that makes us rethink, reimagine our kind of deeply held truths or things we don't see normally.
A Vonnegut trademark, of course, is the way he evolves characters over many years through multiple successive books. How do these different stories help inform the repeat characters, and also the reverse? How do the repeat characters inform the different stories?
So I'm going to tackle those two questions kind of together. For people who are familiar with Vonnegut, they know that the repeat characters are never exactly the same. You know, the Rabo Karabikian in Breakfast of Champions is somewhat different from the Rabo Karabikian who is the narrator and author of the hoax autobiography Bluebeard. So they aren't a one-for-one as they are in some other writers' work. But what they do is really, as I mentioned earlier, create kind of a extended family and connection with his books. But I also think Vonnegut developed close relationships with some of his characters. I already mentioned Kilgore Trout, who is kind of an alter ego for Vonnegut. And he often gives Trout some of the more critical, harsher truths about American society or human beings. He allows Trout to kind of be a mouthpiece for those. And Trout is, of course, a writer himself, a failed science fiction writer who can say things and take us to more outlandish and imaginative places through his fiction. But I think Vonnegut really developed relationships with some of his characters, you know, Elliot Rosewater and Kilgore Trout. And I think it reveals something that Kurt Vonnegut's father said about him, that he tried to create a fictional universe without villains. And so I think sometimes he actually revisits a character to flesh them out and give them more complexity or more of a backstory. You know, we meet Celia Hoover as someone who's committed suicide and is gone in Breakfast of Champions, but then we go to Dead-Eye Dick and get a backstory for her and see her in a different lens. So I think he's not only bringing these characters together to create a fictional cosmos and inhabit places like Ilium and Midland City, but I think he's also showing us his own complicated relationship with these characters and the humanity and faults and everything that he gives them.
Speaking of innovation, when it came to science and technology, Vonnegut had maybe a love-hate relationship. He studied engineering and worked briefly at a technology company, GE. He wrote science fiction. His fictional alter ego, Kilgore Trout, as you said, was also a science fiction writer, but unlike many other works in the genre, think Star Trek, for example, Vonnegut's work didn't typically view science, and particularly space exploration, as this benevolent force for good, did he?
Well, I think his critiques are pretty harsh at times, to put it mildly. I think, though, what Vonnegut really resisted were big technological fixes, and his major source of critique would be science when it's divorced from ethics and humanity. Probably the most obvious example of that is Cat's Cradle, where you have Felix Honecker, a clueless, absent-minded scientist who not only helps invent the atomic bomb, but also a substance that could destroy all the liquid water on Earth. And it's because he's divorced and not thinking about ethics. But in his nonfiction, as you mentioned, he really was a critic of the space program. He had an essay, Excelsior, which appeared in the New York Times. He also had a short story called The Big Space Suck. And he called space exploration, expensive show business. He was afraid that we were just trying to master other worlds, to colonize countries and, imperialism. And so he's very critical, especially when there were so many problems here on Earth where we could have been spending the money for social, environmental, economic programs, which would have been in line with the Reverend Abernathy and the Poor People's March. However, there's this other dimension to Vonnegut's critiques as well. In that essay Excelsior, he critiques the whole program, but then he says that first human footprint on the moon will still be a beautiful thing because it has been a collective human endeavor and a feat of imagination. So he's critical, but I think for good reason, and I think he still can see a lot of the good that can be done. I think he's critical of particular applications, and of course, especially technologies that kill people. He's obviously a strong pacifist as well.
One way to analyze a writer, of course, is to consider how they were influenced by other writers. In your study of Vonnegut, the writer whose influence you discuss most is, understandably, Henry David Thoreau. Vonnegut's environmentalism, his attacks on consumerism, and his ambivalence toward technology are all very Thoreauvian. Like Vonnegut, Thoreau's writing style was also unconventional in many ways. Do you know what Vonnegut himself thought about these comparisons, or can you imagine what he might have thought?
So I couldn't find the exact interview prior to this recording, but he did address the comparison once or twice in some interviews collected in William Rodney Allen's collection of conversations. And what he was mentioning there was that he saw Thoreau sometimes writing in the voice of a child, which I think meant simplicity, straightforward, the unadorned prose, if you will. Which, of course, if you read Walden, know that although the syntax is fairly straightforward, it's layered in all kinds of allusions, and it's quite dense. And I think Vonnegut's writing is somewhat similar in that it's very easy on the reader. It's very easy to digest a Vonnegut novel, but there's so much else going on. But I think the thing that I notice about Vonnegut and Thoreau is that Vonnegut often used whether the Kilgore Trout stories or some of the embedded ideas in his speeches and essays as sorts of parables, if you will. Actually, my favorite Thoreau essay is his Huckleberries essay, which I think illustrates this idea. It begins with this story, but it's all about the commons and our public spaces and how we use land and what that means. And I think that Vonnegut not only took what Thoreau's lessons, as you point out, but some of his ways, unconventional ways of delivering these these truths and messages. And I think, again, they show up, especially in some of his Kilgore Trout stories. Although I don't know if people would, if you put Thoreau and the Kilgore Trout story side by side, I don't think they would necessarily seem all that similar. But I think, as you quite smartly point out, there is a lot of Thoreau beneath the surface of Vonnegut. Thanks for asking that.
One of the themes with which you start the book and return to at the very end is Vonnegut's pessimism about real-world outcomes, that the environmental movement, for example, would not achieve much. How do you think this pessimism serves the causes and his causes and his writing, or does it?
I think that's an important question, because Vonnegut really is often associated with pessimism. Take, for example, his appearance at the first Earth Day. In an interview he did with the Village Voice before it, he called the environmental movement a big soppy pillow and a grand balloon, which is a meaningless association of people. He lamented that no one was going to do anything. And of course, he was famously wrong about that. We had the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, bans on DDT, leaded gasoline, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. And the thing, though, is Vonnegut, of course, you have to look at what he did versus said. After Earth Day, for example, he donated his Bennington address to an organization for these Earth kits. He donated the speech to the Environmental Action Committee to raise money to unseat congressional people with the worst environmental records. And of course, he kept on writing. If he were truly a pessimist, he would not keep writing and trying and getting this message out. And so I think his real goal in channeling that, and that's something people miss, is in writing about environmental apocalypses, he's not saying that he wants them to happen. He's, of course, trying to help us find ways of preventing them. So he's trying to shock us with some of these pronouncements into getting our act together. But I think he actually was much more of an optimist than people give him credit for. And in Lucky Mud and Other Foma, I really try to pull some of that out. But at the end, he was, in the final years of his life, he was depressed. And I think he was truly heartbroken about our lack of action on climate change. There were several times throughout the course of his career when he would stop speaking. He would cut his tour short because he had trouble facing young people. And I can relate to that. Until kind of recently, there was so much bad news. And especially when he was alive, we weren't taking the needed action, especially on climate change. So I think that there's more optimism to his writing that people miss. But I think it would also be false to not address, his pessimism and those pronouncements.
So just to conclude this conversation, you've mentioned several positive developments. What do you think he would say about those? Or about other developments like the Earthshot Prize that awards £1 million each year to 5 environmental problem solvers? Or what would he say, in fact, about his own legacy? That there might be cause for optimism?
I really do think he would be excited. I'm glad you mentioned the Earthshot Prize, because I think that's exactly the type of investment Vonnegut was hoping for, because it's something that invests in kind of grassroots, collective solutions. I was just looking at the 2022 winners, and you see whether, creating these greenhouse kits for small farmers, and you look at what they're doing, reducing water and more affordable things. But the thing is, these are not, this is not Elon Musk. This is not, big tech kinds of overarching solutions that are just going to fix everything. This is sort of a bottom up, the best of humanity, our innovation, our imagination, our kindness, our belief in seeing other human beings as, fellow people with dignity and caring for the planet. So I think things like the Earthshot Prize he would be very excited about. I also think that, we're finally at an exciting moment, whether you look to the Inflation Reduction Act, when you look to the newest figures that renewable energy is going to surpass coal globally as a source of electricity by 2025. We have so much good news right now. It feels like we might actually be turning the ship away from the iceberg right now. And I think Vonnegut would be very excited, and I think he would enjoy seeing that his legacy is still reaching young people. When my students read Galapagos, they come away with hope. They get his environmental messages, and they love the fact that he was caring about the environment, that he experienced climate grief, that he saw these things. So I think Vonnegut would be very pleased to see that legacy, today. And I think he would also be excited by the fact that it's happening all over the planet and from so many different sources and ways of inventing it, sort of channels the best in humanity. So I think he would, if he would obviously be upset about, a lot of the bad things that are happening on the planet, but I think especially some of our recent turns would be inspiring. We all need that hope, I think.
So clearly Vonnegut continues to be both tremendously entertaining and deeply insightful. So thank you, Professor Jarvis, for providing your own insights into this complex and wonderful author, and for talking with us today.
And thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure, and I'm just thrilled that we have such a wonderful SUNY Fredonia English alum in you, Randy. So appreciate all that you do. In the Vonnegut world, you would be a secular saint, someone behaving decently in an indecent society.
Well, thank you. And again, we have been speaking with Professor Christina Jarvis about her new book, Lucky Mud and Other Foma, a field guide to Kurt Vonnegut's Environmentalism and Planetary Citizenship. Available from most booksellers.